Your brand may be staying on top of current trends, but are you agile enough to stay relevant, resilient, and successful as customers, competition, and the world continues to change at a breakneck pace? I'm thrilled to share the newly revised version of my first book, The Agile Brand. I'm calling it The Agile Brand Revisited. It's been updated to reflect our continually changing world, and it provides 7 principles that form the backbone of an agile brand, offering detailed insights and actionable steps for incorporating them into your business strategy. This is the book that started it all, and I'm excited to share it with you. It's now available in print and digital formats and available everywhere. Learn more by going to the Agile Brand Guide website at www.agilebrandguide.com. Welcome to Season 4 of The Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we discuss business agility through customer experience, employee experience, and digital transformation. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at gregkihlstrom.com and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kihlstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile Brand podcast. Today, we're going to talk about combining technology and design psychology to drive business success. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Thomas Watkins, principal and founder of 3Leaf, a design collective using applied psychology and data to enhance the design of products. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about this subject with you. But first, why don't we start by you giving a little background on yourself as well as what you're currently doing at 3Leaf?
Yeah, sure. So my background was in psychology and, spent a long time in graduate school studying people in experiments, putting people through tasks. You design an experiment, people are supposed to do tasks and, respond to stimuli on screens and things like that, and you analyze it. After I left that, I went into UX and had a career, around 14 or so years so far as a UX designer. And my approach and my team's approach at 3Leaf is we make sure that kind of design psychology is the core of everything we do with UX. And I was fortunate enough to get early on education in human factors. Human factors was, kind of one of the original names for UX before the term came around in 2010. And so I think with that being the core and for UX folks to think of things and approach things psychologically is enormously beneficial. And so at 3Leaf, we're consultancy, work primarily with early stage technology companies or established companies who are doing digital transformations. We find that with going into these new projects where you're kind of constantly, starting from zero very often and figuring it all out and getting to something where it's a solution that everybody can be proud of. I find that having psychology and design psychology specifically as a core to that extremely, beneficial as a tool to have in one's toolkit for guiding the process.
Yeah. Well, let's get started here and start by talking about what you do. So, combining technology and design psychology to drive business success. So before we start, you touched on this in your intro, but just, for those a little less familiar, can you define what you mean by design psychology?
Yes. So think of it as, you've got all the different types of psychology, right? You've got clinical psychology where you're working with the mentally ill, or you've got school psychology where you're working with pupils in school and how do they adjust. You've got social psychology. How do people react in social situations? All these things. Design psychology means that we're taking what we know about human beings, how we operate, and we're applying it to the design of things, right? So there's a whole process that, through your senses, when information comes in, through the perception of how that's the first step of that processing, all the way to your cognition, your thinking, and then all the way out to your behavior. There's a whole process of understanding humans that when you know about it, you're able to engineer for it. One analogy I give is ergonomics. So when you think of like ergonomics, I give this example, like ergonomic scissors, the grip for the fingers, it assumes that you have fingers and you're holding it with that. Ergonomic chair takes into account the nature of your back and where pressure needs to be. When we design technology solutions for people, we can take into account how do people perceive things? How do people remember and forget things? How much can people retain in their heads? And where do people look on a screen, right? Through, eye tracking research. And you can take that knowledge and use it to help you engineer better solutions so that what you're doing can resonate more with people. The low bar is you want it to be usable. The higher bar is you want it to be a delightful user experience when you're designing things.
Yeah. Yeah. So are there points of friction between technology, which, in my experience is often based on, you don't want to over-engineer things, and there's sort of a conservation of efforts, so to speak, in things, and design psychology, which is, this human-centered approach. So, what are some areas where those two things conflict?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a really good point, and since this show dealing with agile, that is relevant, right? To because we have the kind of the business pragmatic and technology interest. Are you kind of talking about that where you have just different constraints when you're building? Yeah. So when you're building technology, of course, you have the different constraints, time, money, effort that goes into things. And then you have on the flip side, what's this great thing that you want to be able to design?
Right.
And all designers in their career, particularly a lot of I guess the ones that come out of academia, that people go into UX from different angles. You can kind of come out of the behavioral science. You can come out through the world of art. And however you come into UX, you're bringing in this academic philosophical tradition with you. And with that comes a set of values about how things should be. And oftentimes there's a certain level of rigor in the expectations of the designer in terms of how much you have to put in order to make it a desirable solution. On the flip side, we're operating in the business world, and there's not infinite money and there's not infinite time. So you have to balance that out. And so I think the points of friction are finding those balances between, look, we want the solution to be good, but it has to at least exist, right? It's not helping anybody if it doesn't get into the release at all. And so I think that there's this kind of, over the past, as long as Agile's been around, I've gone to conferences and seen where people give talks and they say like, okay, how do we do our work as designers yet operate within the heavy constraints of the sprints and the 2-week cycles and so forth? And then out of that, you have like kind of creative things that folks come up with, like design sprints and, working within that. But I think that is one of the biggest constraints, is learning how to operate and getting the best you can get for now and into the product. One of the big things for designers and people on the product side to kind of know is that it's the crawl, walk, run method, right? If you improve things now and you improve it a certain percentage and you make people's lives easier, that really is a victory, and you don't need to get to the whole giant, huge thing that you really want. You can accept other levels of improvement.
Yeah, and I think that for those of us that are used to working in an agile world, it might come naturally. I think for some it may not quite come as naturally, but it all kind of involves prioritization, right? So can you talk a little bit about, every situation, I would imagine, is different, and there's different constraints and different requirements and all that. But how do you look at prioritizing? When it comes down to prioritizing technology and or engineering versus technology, versus prioritizing design and the user. Like how should you think about that?
So the way I kind of approach that is that you need in terms of the pillars of the folks involved with the product team. You've got the strategy kind of representative, right? That's going to be the product owner. You're going to have the designer who comes to that meetings where the requirements are disseminated, and hopefully you probably have a technical architect in that meeting, and there might be other stakeholders. But I kind of look at it as almost like parties of like a party system where
Yeah.
you've got these advocates that so you've got like the business party, the user party, and then kind of like the
Yeah.
technology party. And I think that the best case scenario that I've seen is you want those three or so different parties. You could throw in their marketing perhaps, but those kind of main three parties to be roughly mostly equally powerful. And a lot of times that's on a professional to learn how to represent their ideas, how to assert themselves properly in those kinds of scenarios. But you want to make sure that there's some kind of a proper balance, because I think we've probably all seen scenarios where there's like one uh, uh, kind of side that outweighs the other. It might
Yeah.
be like a super strong marketing team or sales team at a company, and it has like this really overbearing effect, and then that's where you get like this imbalance there. But
Yeah.
as designers, we really look to the strategy vertical to really provide that prioritization. And our role in the prioritization, I see, is to try to make sure it's as informed as possible. So, are there areas of user research that we could be doing to help be the tiebreaker when there's, uh, a debate on the table of should we go in this direction or that direction, or should we choose to build this feature first or that one? There are things that on the UX side, research and design, that we can do to help facilitate that process. But yeah, I think of it. I like this term. It's called a team of rivals, where
Yeah.
you have like a innately rivalrous kind of relationship between them, but you know how to be like a team. And a lot of times you get the best synergy out of those situations, right? You get a lot of good quality that's well balanced coming out of those situations.
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes the work better, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
there are dysfunctional teams that disagree with each other, of course, but that's not what you're talking about at all.
Right.
I think that
Right.
it's like a lawyer once explained it to me as well, where that's how the legal system works well. It works well because everyone is making the best possible argument, and
Correct.
someone even with a their case isn't as good necessarily, but they make the best possible argument. It makes the winning team even better, right? And so I think that's what you're talking about here, and
Exactly.
it's interesting to hear you explain it that way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and some of the really pragmatic considerations for businesses doing this is that you want to give, in this case, design their own vertical. This might be hard for some companies, right? They might not be used to that. They might be, I find some companies are concerned that the designers will have like too much agency and kind of like
Yeah.
run off into like into a certain kind of direction, right? And then, but you're really doing yourself a favor if you give each segment their own vertical and their kind of reporting structure. Because one mistake I've seen made is if you take like all of the designers and you shove them under marketing. There might be
Right.
situations where that could possibly work, but I haven't really witnessed it. And a lot of times you don't get, or design completely under engineering. That can work if the engineering team really understands and appreciates design. They might internally be able to represent those needs well. I have seen that happen. But what you really want to move toward is having those verticals having their own kind of column in their own system of incentives, their own operations, their own way of running things, and being able to represent those interests. Because when you have the stakeholders coming at those seats at the table, you want them to honestly represent that that opinion or that viewpoint,
Yeah.
to get,
Yeah.
like you said, kind of the better product in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Well, let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about another topic, which is visualizing data for optimal
Yes.
communication.
Yes.
This is something I feel very passionately about, and but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just why is visualizing data so important when you're trying to communicate with other teams?
Yeah. So the first reason is that data by itself is not it's not intuitive. And what I mean by that is if you just show somebody tables, they have to discern things for themselves. And so the whole purpose of data visualization is that we're putting it in a form where we can more easily and pre-attentively gain insights from the data. You can look at it and you can see instantly some things about the nature of that data, right?
Yeah.
And this is why statisticians came up with these ways of plotting lines and dots and squares and things like that onto a sheet, because those are things that we can look at. They're objects, and we can kind of look at them and see natural relationships with them perceptually, and they represent things about the data that we care about, quantities and how tightly things cluster, how far away, and where things located. And so the important thing is allowing people to gain insights from the data. The data is important, and every job role has data that's important to them. So the key is that you want to take this massively important data that you're collecting. We're collecting more and more of it because we have the technology to be able to. And you want to be able to put that in a form where people can easily, where it can support people and empower people to make decisions that they need to make daily based upon that data. So the visualization becomes very important because we're naturally wired to be able to perceive most of our world visually and to be able to gain insights through that mode, that that channel. And so data visualization is important, I think, for those reasons.
Yeah, yeah, and I would expand it even to say, in my life as a consultant and previously, I write a lot of documents, and there's a lot of words on those documents, and yet what I found and found most recently is turning a like 3 paragraphs of text into a flow chart, a
Yeah.
diagram, even if it's, I mean, I have a design background and stuff like that, but I don't look at it as a design exercise. I look at it
That's right.
as you know what, if I give someone a 3-page document, there's no way they're going to read this.
Right.
Why don't I turn this into something where, they may even have questions about it, but once they get those questions answered, it's gonna immediately click versus, oh, well, look at paragraph 8 on page 2 or stuff like that. And that's different than what you were just talking about as far as visualizing data, but it's not so different to me. And I think just in general,
Right.
there's this reluctance, I guess, from people who they say, I'm not a designer, I'm not creative, I can't make infographics, I can't draw, whatever that is. What advice would you have to those people that kind of have that barrier to visualizing things?
Yeah, I mean, my advice to them would be, you can keep it small. I think I, remember that the whole purpose is communication. I would tell folks.
Yeah.
In my data viz classes, I always make this distinction between data visualization and data art, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
with the argument that too many folks are trying to do data art, right, where they're trying to take the data and then express themselves with it or come up with some interest, inspiring
Yeah.
visualization based upon it, where the main purpose really should be communication. You want it to look good, that's fine, but you want to communicate. So you think to yourself, if you're presenting data where there's already data and you already know what the point is, know what that point is and what point are you trying to get across. If you're doing a report and the recipient of that report, you want them to be able to see something with their own eyes, because I think you're 100% right. If you have 3 paragraphs kind of describing a problem versus you could say, look, here are the 3
Right.
sales channels, or here are the departments, here's how they compare, or here's what happened over the past 6 months. Being able to see those dots or plots, just seeing that there really helps them to see, the user to say like, okay, or the consumer to say, okay, I'm looking at the situation. Now I can see the description of it. But I think that folks can start simple. They don't need to be the greatest, some great artist or anything like that. Just take one point, go to the data, kind of make sure you're doing it right. If you're not that familiar with the data, maybe consult the data science department at your organization or something like that. But I think keep it simple. A little can go a long way. Just a little visual of just a comparison of just a bar chart or a line dot. You don't have to be fancy. Here's another thing I like to point out too. Don't feel like the visualization has to be the most entertaining thing in the world. You would be surprised how much people care about the visualization when it's data that matters to them. One of the examples that I give is like, if you woke up one morning and you checked your bank account and you found that this account now has $1 million in it, then it doesn't normally. You don't need the words to be dancing on the screen for you to be excited about that, because that's a number that's meaningful to you. You know what it means. So I think knowing the stuff that really matters to people, and to isolate your data down to the point, and don't think of it in a data set centric way. Don't start with the data set and say like, okay, I'm going to plug this into, Excel or whatever, and I'll make a visualization. No, make it revolve around a point that you actually want to make, and then make a graph of that. And that's going to be a way that you can kind of get over that hump, I think, of being able to see the value in a data visualization that you've made.
Yeah. I think that's great advice. Well, one last question before we wrap up here, kind of going back to the first topic we were talking about. For those product designers out there, trying to balance what we were talking about earlier, technology, design psychology, what's some advice you would have for them and as they navigate the months ahead?
So in terms of designers, if you're on a product team, I would say that sometimes, if you're trying to achieve something more with the product and there's a lot of constraints that are maybe getting in the way, one thing that I find works for a lot of folks is consider doing kind of a dual track system, right? Where you are designing on one side what you think the product should be, and the other track is where you're just keeping developers unblocked. And this takes a lot of time, because it a little bit, in some ways, doubles your effort or the amount of stuff that you need to do at work. But sometimes folks get a little bit jaded if they want their product to be a certain way, or they want things to go into a certain direction, but maybe people aren't receptive to it, or you don't have enough buy-in. Continue to bake those ideas and continue to develop those anyway, while providing the day-to-day needs. And what you could find is that at some point you can make a pitch in the future, or, kind of show it to the right people, that, get the right eyeballs on it. And you might not get your dream necessarily, but you might be able to have an impact and add value in a way that you didn't expect by doing that. And, separating those two things out, rather than becoming jaded about, folks not listening. And that can be a helpful way of doing it.
Yeah. I love that. Well, Thomas, thanks so much for joining the show. Yeah. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
I guess find me on LinkedIn, Thomas Watkins, and also on my website, 3Leaf, the number 3, leaf.consulting. You can also find me there.
Wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank Thomas Watkins, principal and founder of 3Leaf, for joining the show. Thanks for listening to The Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom. Talk with you next week.
Thanks again for listening to the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.theagilebrand.show. To get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, visit my website at gregkihlstrom.com. Until next week, stay agile.